Welcome to this video about nonlinear graphs. All the questions in this booklet are where you have to match the graph to the correct equation. You can find the PDF of the questions, clues and solutions on mathsupgrade.co.uk. The first question here, you're given 4 graphs and you have to match them to the equations in the table underneath. So what I'm just going to do, I'm just going to write a few notes next to each one. I'm going to make comments on what I can see. So this first one here, you can see it's got a positive y-intercept, so it's going through the y-axis here at a positive value. That's important. It's also got a constant gradient and it's a linear graph, so it won't have any x squared or x cubed or anything like that. It's just a linear graph, okay? And it's got a positive gradient, so the gradient is going uphill. It's positive, okay? This graph here, you can see it's a quadratic, right? It's a quadratic graph. That's a non-linear graph. This graph here is of the type of a reciprocal. And this graph here, similar to this one, but it's got a negative gradient. Then if I start to look at the equations underneath, okay, so you can see equation, the first equation here, you're given that y equals x squared minus 7. So that's got x squared in it. So that's the form of a quadratic. So that's going to be graph B. This equation here, you can see that y equals 3 minus 2x. So you can see that the gradient of x here, the gradient is negative. It's got a negative coefficient. The number in front of x is negative. So that's going to be graph D. Next equation here, you can see that the coefficient of x is positive. The number next to x here is positive. So that's going to be graph A. And the last one here, that's a reciprocal. X is on the bottom of a fraction there. So that is going to be graph C. So there's the answers there for those graphs. So that was 2 marks for that question. Question 2. We're again given 4 graphs and we're given 4 descriptions of some functions. Okay, let's look at these graphs first of all. This graph here, you can see it's a curve and it looks like a trigonometric graph. Okay, this is actually known as the sin curve, so this is sin x. This graph here is a reciprocal graph. This graph D here, that's known as an exponential function. This graph here, you may not have seen this very often. This is known as a square root graph. So given that, I'm just going to label up, this is sin x, this is reciprocal, this is exponential, and this one here is root. So I can then match those up. Graph A goes with the trigonometric function here. Graph B is a reciprocal, so it's inversely proportional to x. Graph C is square root x, and graph D is the exponential function. That question was worth 2 marks. Question 3. I'm given 5 graphs here and I have to match them up again to 5 equations. So this shape of graph here, this is known as reciprocal. This is like a linear graph, so like y equals mx plus c. This graph here is known as a square root. Graph y is known as a quadratic, so it's got an x squared function in it. And this graph here is known as a cubic, so we'll have x cubed somewhere in there. So I've just written that next to each one there. Then if I start to match up some of the more straightforward ones. So the reciprocal, so that's going to be where you've got x on the bottom of a fraction, on the denominator of a fraction. So that's going to be the 4th one here. So y equals k over x is graph A. Graph B is a linear function. So linear function, so that's just y equals kx, the bottom one here. Graph C, the square root one, so that's going to be this second one here, y equals k root x. Graph A is a quadratic, so you're looking for an x squared term, so that's this one here, y equals kx squared, which just leaves graph E, which is y equals kx cubed. So that question there was worth 3 marks. Question 4. I have to match up some of the graphs with the equations which are in the table underneath. So let's just notice some of these graphs here. So this graph here is known as an exponential function. So this is where you're looking for x as being a power of a number. This graph here is known as a reciprocal. This graph here is known as a sin curve, so a trigonometric function. This graph here is similar to the sin curve, but it's known as a cos curve, so cosine function. Graph E is known as a quadratic. Graph F is known as a cubic function, so with x cubed. Graph G is also known as a quadratic, but it's the opposite of this one, it's upside down, so it's a negative x squared term. Graph H is known as a positive reciprocal, so this was a negative reciprocal, this one's a positive reciprocal. And graph I is known as inverse exponential, so it's where x is a negative index of a number. So given that, if I then label up some of those with what I've just said, I'm going to start to look at the equations underneath. So the first equation here, y equals sin x, so that's going to be graph C. Y equals x cubed plus 4x, so that's going to be graph F, this x cubed function here. Y equals 2 to the x, so that's an exponential function, that's going to be graph A. And y equals 4 over x, that's going to be graph H, which is this one here, the positive reciprocal. So there's my answers for those questions there. The whole question there is worth 3 marks. Question 5. Here are 6 graphs. So we need to write down the letter of the graph that could have the equation y equals 2 to the x and y equals x cubed minus 3x. So this is a more difficult question, this is. First of all, the first part is fairly straightforward. So looking for an exponential function. So that's going to be graph D. This is a positive exponential, this will be a negative exponential. Okay, so that's graph D there. The next one here, this is a cubic function. So it's either going to be graph A or graph F. What I'm going to do here, I'm just going to factorize this, right? And I'm going to put y as being equal to 0. So if I put y is equal to 0, then I get 0 equals x cubed minus 3x. If I then factorize this, I get 0 equals x brackets x squared minus 3. So when y equals 0, x can either be equal to 0 or it can be equal to plus or minus 3. So look at where y equals 0 on this graph or on this graph. So y equals 0 on this graph, for example, just once. Right, that's the only place on this curve of y equals 0. It only cuts this x-axis, the y equals 0 line, at 1 point. This curve here cuts it at 3 points. It cuts it at 0, but it also cuts it at 2 points either side of 0. So graph A must be the graph for this equation here. So that question is worth 2 marks. So if you struggle with any of these questions, be sure to look at my other graphs videos, such as linear graphs, cubic, exponential and reciprocal graphs. Okay, and those videos are all available on this channel. Thanks for watching.